So as was mentioned, I teach a course on yoga philosophy at HPU, and I'm going to speak extemporaneously a little bit about how I see some of the things going on in the world today and how it relates to some of the research and teaching and writing I've done. And I don't know about you, but a lot of what I see right now on the news and on social media reels is a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger in the world right now. And through spiritual practice, that can be a real challenge, right? But anger can also be a useful tool, but it can be a dangerous one, right? Anger can be a dangerous tool. And one of the things that we learn about the origins of anger in the South Asian tradition is a lot of it comes from ignorance, right? And one of the first things that I teach my students in yoga philosophy and in my introduction to non-Western philosophy courses is the difference between a lot of the Abrahamic Western philosophical and religious traditions and the South Asian traditions. So in the Judeo-Christian traditions, a lot of the origin stories comes from this idea of Adam and Eve, right, in the Garden of Eden. And the problem tends to be one of original sin. Well, in the South Asian traditions, the problem is original ignorance, avidya, is we don't know fully who and what we are, right? And that ignorance leads to confusion, it leads to anger, it can lead to hatred, sometimes self-hatred, sometimes other hatred, and it leads to confusion. And sometimes that can lead to things like war. Sometimes it can lead to causing suffering of others and suffering of ourselves, right? And here we're gathered today on International Yoga Day, which is to be a day of peace, right? And yet we live in Kali Yuga, right? We live in an age where we are surrounded by suffering. And so what do we do? How do we manage this? And one thing that I notice in my own yoga spiritual practice is oftentimes that, like in Ashtanga yoga, the first two limbs of yoga are ethics. And this is often not talked about enough, if at all, right? And it's yama and niyama, the restraints and the observances, the things we ought to do, not just for ourselves, but for others socially, and the things we ought not to do, right? Ahimsa, nonviolence. Gandhi talked a lot about nonviolence. He also talked about anger, though. And what do we do, and how do we wrestle with that, right? So I just want to read some of these things of the first couple limbs of Ashtanga yoga that so many people practice, but they don't so much talk about. So yama, the first limb of Ashtanga yoga, the 5 restraints. It's ahimsa, truthfulness, non-stealing, chastity, and not being greedy. Right? This is ethics. So what does that mean for our spiritual practice? It means that to truly be centered, to truly be able to do downward dog and vinyasa flow and all of that stuff, and to have it work for yourself, we need to be ethical. We need to be moral, not just to ourselves, but to our neighbors, right? And I think part of what a lot of philosophers and part of what I think a lot of yogis and yoginis teach is that the spiritual practice extends beyond the door of the studio. It extends to your neighbor, and it extends to society, and it extends to the kid at school who doesn't have food in their belly, and it extends to your neighbors who are terrorized or not. And so when we see this world of anger and hatred and fear, we need to take that practice from that peace we're trying to establish in our heart and establish that with each other. Because we need to literally be that change we want to see in the world, but we need to take those angas of the Ashtanga Yoga and do that in society. Because that spiritual transition that we're trying to see in ourselves, some of the philosophers like Sri Aurobindo talk about that has to be done at a societal level. It's not just about me, right? As the previous speaker talked about, I am one with all living beings. if I'm one with all living beings, then their suffering is my suffering. That suffering is not owned. It's not owned. It might be more personable to you when you have a toothache. I don't feel that. But that suffering isn't owned, right? So the second of the Sangha Yoga is niyama, of observances. So the first is don't do these things, and now there's 5 things you should do. Purity, to be pure. Austerity, self-study, devotion to Ishvara, to the Lord, and contentment, right? And so the message there is how do you deal with this, towards this path towards, or away from ignorance and towards enlightenment? You start with morality, you start with ethics. And then you can have focus on chitta, vritta, nirodha, that cessation of those mental fluctuations that yoga is all about, that equanimity of mind. And it's not just about you, it's about us. Yeah. So I'll end with one of the greatest and hardest lessons that I've learned is from when the Dalai Lama was here a few years ago. He came and he spoke, and he talked about the greatest teacher you'll ever have is your greatest enemy. The person who, pardon my French, the person who pisses you off the most, the person who makes you the most angry, the most furious, is your greatest teacher. Because if you can have loving kindness for that person, then you have mastered anger. If you can have compassion and love for those who have hatred towards you, then there's hope in this world, right? And that's hard. Because for some of us, that greatest enemy is the self, right? For some of us, that person is with us every day. Maybe it's an abuser, right? Maybe it was a parent, right? Maybe it's your government or the one next door. Maybe it's the president, right? Or the police. Whoever it is, we need to not succumb to hatred ourselves for spiritual practice to work. We need to have love. The answer to hatred and anger is love. And that's what that spiritual practice needs to do for us, is not shut off the anger that is around us and say, oh no, I need to just do yoga and meditate and try to hope that we survive whatever's going on outside. We need to take that calmness and step outside and bring that calmness into the world and try to make the world more calm through our calmness. Yeah. So, namaste. Thank you.
So much, Matt. That was a really lovely explanation. I think